Welcome, everybody. Let's talk some colonial American politics. How about that? And remember, complement this with what you read in the book, and you will ace this question. So, what made many colonial Americans so politically experienced in the 1700s? And I think this is a good way to differentiate revolutionary America from maybe revolutionary Eastern Bloc in Europe after the Soviets pulled out in 1989, or even looking at all the Arab Spring in the Middle East. And why didn't democracies come out of the Arab Spring, or why didn't strong democracies come out of Eastern Europe, or for that matter, for Central America in the post-independence time? That's just a point of historical comparison you can look up on your own, or we can talk about it over coffee someday. Well, let's look at how the colonies were governed. Remember, there's 13 colonies, not all at once, but in the late colonial era, 13 different colonies. And all the colonies had governors, and all the colonies had assemblies. Just like today, California has a governor, and we have an assembly, which is a representative branch that we vote for. Our local, never mind. Governors and assemblies ran the colonies together. And this is what the governor had power of the assembly. This is a British-based attempt to separate powers and balance the powers. So this is like Civics 101, but I just want to give it to you in a context of U.S. colonial history. So the governor could veto laws passed by the assemblies, a lot like the president and the governor of California can do today. The governor can also dismiss them, fire them all. Today, they can't do that. But back in the colonial era, they could just dismiss all the assemblies. But they could also call elections whenever they wanted to. For example, if things are going politically well for the colony, the governor might want to call an election because he perhaps would be, and his supporters in the assemblies, be elected. He could also not hold elections, right? Decide not to hold elections. And this actually happened in Massachusetts, I think, for a 15-year period. There were no elections because the governor refused to call them when Massachusetts were being a bunch of rebels. The governor is an extension of the king. He holds the executive branch of power. Okay? Most colonies, the governor of the colony was appointed, right? The governor named somebody who was his ally and says, you're going to go be the governor of Georgia. You're going to go be the governor of New York or of New Jersey. The exceptions to this were, for example, New England. New England, remember from its Massachusetts charter, had a tradition of electing its own governors. Rather unique New England. It's not a surprise that the revolution started in New England. And the governor's job was to enforce the law, right? Enforcers. That's same as today's president. They are the commander-in-chief who enforce the law. However, most appointed governors lived and stayed in England, right? If they're the governor of Georgia or South Carolina, they would just send some minion or some person to go do the everyday job of governance, and they would stay in their fancy place in England. Needless to say, this did not help the people of that colony feel very close to their governor if the governor wouldn't even bother to come and live in the colony they're governing. An example of colonial politics in the 1700s and what's really going to upset colonists and also unify them is something you're reading about, I think, in chapter 13. King James II rises to the throne. He's going to be the last of the Stuart monarchs, and he's going to attempt to impose dominion over America. You guys are answering a couple questions about that. He's trying to, and succeeding in ruling as monarchs had done for a long time in European history, be the absolute monarch in which they are in charge of everything. Subjects are an extension of him. If you go against the king, you're committing treason on him. So in other words, King James II felt that he was the state and he ruled like the state. This is going to really upset people in colonial America. For example, when King James II names New York Governor Edmund Andros the governor of New England and unifies the dominion of New England with New York, This is going to make many, many people in Massachusetts and elsewhere very upset. These are some of the roots of the tension and long time conflict between Boston and New York, and also it also makes for good baseball rivalries. So King James was trying to have dominion not only over colonial America but also over parliamentarians in Britain, and this made him many, many enemies in the British Parliament. So what the British Parliament did, Parliament is just their name for their assembly, what their House of Representatives did in England, they called the Parliament, overthrew King James. They kicked him out. This is historic. And they named, through law, a new king and queen. So when you see like this body, the Parliament, is throwing out the king, you know that the power now lies with the Parliament. Okay, King James could do nothing about it. And the Parliament named their new William and Mary the King and Queen and the saviors of of England. So this is a watershed moment in which we see political supremacy move from the king or the monarch in Britain to the Parliament or the Assembly. Okay, Parliament and Assembly, basically same thing. So when British colonists, who are British subjects, remember, when they see this happening in the mother country, that supremacy is going from the executive branch down to the assembly, they are going to demand the same thing. So British colonial assemblies demanded and took a central role in the government, right? Especially since most of the governors were not around. So British Americans got experience in taxing themselves, right? There was taxation in British colonial America. The colonies just did it to themselves. New York taxed for road building, okay, for the militia, for money for representatives, etc. And the British American colonial assemblies also took care of the budgets and paid governors. Okay, I hope you can see how this is important. So the colonial assemblies, I spelled it wrong, but you can figure it out. There we go. The colonial assemblies had decades of experience governing themselves and taxing themselves. This is going to answer the question, why were colonial Americans so political? Why were white men so politically experienced? Because they were. Who were these assemblymen? Who were these representatives of the colonies? Well, they were colonial members themselves. Okay, they made up mostly of the greater gentry, the top 2%, except in New England. In New England, had very little or no property restrictions. Right. So once again, New England is a lot more democratic, as you saw in the chapters you read about early Puritan New England. These assemblymen were only paid living expenses. So it would take a wealthy person to leave his job, leave his occupation, go to the capital of the colony and govern without getting paid. So only the wealthy. Here's a picture of George Washington on his plantation. Here are his slaves getting, this is a romanticized view, but here are his slaves getting a little liquid break while others are harvesting hay or probably wheat. Okay, and this woman's getting tended to. So who were the assemblymen? Part 2. In New England, free propertied men. Right, you didn't have to own much, but if you're a free guy and you own property in New England, you could be an assemblyman. Everywhere else, much higher property requirements. For example, in most of the South, 180 acres at least. If you owned 170, you couldn't become an assemblyman. In the middle colonies, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, 120, so it's less so. What about the lower gentry? We talked about them. This is the top 2 to 10% wealthiest in colonial America. Well, they could make it as far as justices of the peace, which was a very important job, and also militia officers up to captain. So there was room for growth, even though it was rather limited. This by far beats any upward mobility available in the old world. Who could vote? Well, propertied white men could vote. Right? It's never been open to all in colonial America. You had to have a house, a farm, If you were an artisan in the north or wherever, you had to show tools, you had to have a shop. And elections were held at the county seat, often very, very far. Could you imagine if all our Shasta County elections were held in Reading? People from far off Bernie, right, from Igo and Ono would have to go all the way down to Reading, usually to one polling place, and vote. So you could see how this would limit voting for many in far off places. Also, voting was face to face. Could you imagine? You have George Washington sitting at a table, and the guy who's running against him sitting right next to him at the table. You come up to them and say, "I am for you, Mr. Washington." Right? You can see how that's not too democratic, and much later on we come up with the private ballot. So even face-to-face voting is very personal. Rural elections. Rural elections were a big party. They were in the city as well. But let me give you an example. There were raucous, big booze-ups. In 1758, for example, George Washington most graciously hosted the election in which he was running for a colonial assembly seat. And he gave all those who came to vote 2 quarts of what he called bumbo. Bumbo was his mixture of rum, water, sugar, and nutmeg. Right? So he's definitely greasing the wheels to, right, endear you to him, and also just making a big old party of it. Right? Rural elections. Voter turnout was low, as I mentioned, because you have to travel. Most folks had to travel very far, or they were apathetic, like today. Elections in the cities, much higher turnout because it was just closer. Oftentimes the county seat was in the city you were living in. Overall, people in the city, propertied people who had money, white propertied people in the city, were better educated and more literate. And this especially goes for the North. Compare this to England or Ireland, right? In colonial America, 60% of white males could vote, right? And in some places, New Jersey and New York, in the late colonial era, even some free blacks could vote too if they had property. Right? This is odd to think about in an era of slavery, but there was this gradual shifting up to the Revolutionary era about the role of free blacks in society. In England, only 20% of men could vote, and in Ireland, only 10% of men could vote. So America truly was much more democratic in relation to the mother country. So by the 1760s, after decades of white male government experience in colonial America, in which they had taxed themselves, they had governed themselves, they had argued over local and colonial issues, when the British Parliament tried to reorganize its whole colonial system after the 7 Years' War with France, the British Parliament was broke. It had helped fight off the French, spent a lot of its blood and treasure. So the British Parliament starts to tax colonial America and comes up with the declaratory law, which says, you're going to read about it, which is going to declare it can make any law whatsoever and impose it upon the colonies. This is not going to make colonial Americans very happy, who had been used to decades of mostly governing themselves. So in 1774, in the face of increased imperial reorganization and increased cracking down on the freedoms and on the economy of colonial Americans, Paul Revere, you know him, the British coming gentleman from Boston, he pens this drawing, very much a political drawing. So what you see here is America who has for over 100 years now, whenever you see cartoons or paintings of America, America's depicted as a Native American woman, an often half-dressed, topless Native American woman. This symbolizes America. And what is America suffering from? Well, the Boston Port Bill is in the pocket of the gentleman who is forcing tea down America's throat, basically tea-boarding her or waterboarding her. And the British judiciary is holding her down. Okay, and on the right hand side you have military law that's enforcing this punishment of America. And on the left, Lord Sandwich is about to rape America. Lord Sandwich is the gentleman on his knees to the left. And in the background, the woman holding her eyes in disgrace is a symbol of Britannica. Britannica does not want to see what's happening to her colonial outposts. And those two gentlemen on the left, you probably guessed, the guy with the twirly mustache is a Frenchman, and the guy on the far left is Spaniard. And they're saying something like, well, when your colonial subjects start to misbehave, you have to teach them a lesson, and this is how you do it. So what this comes to symbolize is when the British, when revolutionaries in Boston refused to buy the taxed colonial tea offered to them by the British come in, send the military in, send troops in, and force colonial America to drink the tea. So you can rest on that and check it out at your leisure. So who's going to come and save America? Paul Revere's message here seems to be America is being raped, being waterboarded, and the British are not going to help us. The French and the Spanish are just looking on. They're not going to help us. Who's going to help America? Well, the Americans are. And here is George Washington in this fantastic painting of the Christmas crossing of the Potomac, a sneak attack upon the British Army. And I invite you to, after this lecture, watch Part 1, Reluctant Revolutionaries, which outlines and complements this lecture a little further. So, I hope you will ace this part, what made many colonial Americans so politically experienced in the 1700s. Okay. And I've also added this. This is just the description of Paul Revere's drawing that he did. This is a total piece of political propaganda. Paul Revere wanted to incite Americans to act. As you'll see in the film Reluctant Revolutionaries, many Americans were very reluctant to take up arms against Britain. They did not want to. They did not want to take up arms against Britain. It was their mother country, and for reasons I will discuss in the next lecture about the American Revolution. All right, goodbye for now.